Hey there, I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill. His behavior in the early years of World War II was heroic. Churchill was right about the threat from Hitler long before anybody else was, and he played a vital role in taking the Nazis down. But I have a problem with the way that US politicians idolize the guy. Winston Churchill is not an example to follow. He got one crisis absolutely right, but if you take an honest look at the full arc of his career and what it meant for his country, you're probably going to arrive at an inescapable conclusion. Winston Churchill was a loser. Winston Churchill was born to run the British Empire. He reveled in the fact that he was descended from one of the greatest British heroes of the 1700s. As a moneyed aristocrat, he didn't have much trouble starting his parliamentary career in 1900 at the age of 25. For the next 55 years, Churchill played a leading role in the decline and fall of the British Empire. This is not what Churchill intended. If you review his positions and his many comments and policies that are today seen as racist or even genocidal, you'll realize that he was a passionate supporter of the British Empire. He completely failed in his efforts to preserve that entity, and he played a number of key roles in the destruction of that empire. A key part of the Churchill story is the fact that he was booted out of power in the decade before World War II. He was disrespected by the British government and by his own Conservative Party. He was a lion alone. What's often left out of that story is how richly deserved that isolation was. Before finally getting the crisis with Adolf Hitler absolutely right, he got almost everything else absolutely wrong. He pushed the series of dumb wars that bankrupted the British Empire and brought about its end. His one job prior to government was as a soldier and propagandist for Britain's disastrously expensive wars in Sudan and South Africa. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he was an enthusiastic participant in the arms race that helped bring about the First World War. Churchill lost his job running the British Navy after pushing the Dardanelles campaign early on in that war. It was a horrifically costly failure that helped form a national identity for Australia and New Zealand that was distinct from the British one. Again, not what he had in mind. Churchill crept back into government in the 1920s when his economic management was bad enough to bring the Great Depression to Britain a number of years earlier than elsewhere. This, combined with views on India that were seen as racist even back then, kept him out of government in the 1930s. If Britain had adopted Churchill's extreme anti-independence position on India, World War II in Asia could have gone very, very differently. Instead, with the promise of eventual self-government, most Indians agreed to help fight off the Japanese. So it's probably a very good thing that Churchill was out of government in the 1930s. Winston Churchill was a fighter. Finally, in 1940, that was exactly what Britain needed. The world should be very grateful that he was there during that dark time. But US politicians should look at the full arc of Churchill's career. In fact, it was the belligerence of Churchill and many leaders like him that got Britain to that dark time in 1940 and eventually ended the British Empire. Throughout Churchill's career, he had one goal: the preservation and expansion of the British Empire. In 1900, at the start of Churchill's career, Britain was the most powerful country in the world. And if it had played its cards right, there was no reason it couldn't have continued. In 1956, with the Suez Crisis, Winston Churchill's chosen successor made it painfully clear that the British Empire was no longer capable of independent action. On his own terms, Winston Churchill was a spectacular loser. This video may seem unfair. Winston Churchill was a great hero. But his career and the fall of the British Empire are not distant historical examples we can put up on a shelf and admire. In fact, the US today faces a lot of the same sorts of problems that the world-leading British Empire faced 150 years ago. We really shouldn't be reaching for the same solutions that Churchill did. If the United States ever faces another Hitler, then Winston Churchill is absolutely the right example to follow. For absolutely everything else, Churchill's example should be avoided like the plague. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you want to know more about these questions, I suggest you check out my new book, Avoiding the British Empire, available now on the Amazon Kindle and in paperback form. And come back next week when we'll ask whether the British were nicer imperialists than the French were.